loves talking about artificial intelligence, and I especially love talking about artificial intelligence policy and ethics. At the law school, I teach a course on artificial intelligence and law. I also teach courses on ethics, on professional responsibility, and I think there is a lot of overlap there. And it's really important to me that we all stop being scared of this technology. It's important to me that we all start thinking about how we can understand it and that we can have a seat at the table. Don't get me wrong, I think there's plenty to fear, and I'll go through that in my presentation today. But no one should think, I'm not a technical person, that stuff's above my head, I don't know, I'll let someone else figure it out. We all need to be in this conversation. Okay, let's start with the basics of artificial intelligence. Okay, artificial intelligence is just a subfield of computer science, and it's a term that we use for things where we're programming computers to do something that is traditionally done by humans. That's all artificial intelligence is at its base, okay? The way that most artificial intelligence will work is through something called an algorithm, okay? So you've probably heard of algorithmic decision making or algorithmic processes or programs or something. An algorithm is just a series of commands, okay? That's all an algorithm is. They're guidelines that tell you how to perform a task. So my mom's banana nut bread recipe, which I believe comes from Bethany Church up in Bethany, West Virginia, that's an algorithm, okay? It's a series of commands. It's a step-by-step instructions on how you are going to accomplish a task. You probably used algorithms on your drive here if you used any kind of GPS, or you may have used an algorithm as you were thinking through even your own packing list and how to get ready for this. You were using an algorithm. So just think of algorithms as a set of guidelines that tell you how to perform a task. When an algorithm is directing a computer what to do, that we call a code or a program, okay? So let's start with those sort of basics, and now let's layer that on. As I said, artificial intelligence is nothing new. It's been around for a long time. A lot of us, we might sort of conjure up images of Orwell or Blade Runner or something like that, but artificial intelligence has been around and at use in our society for decades now. Machine learning has also been around for decades, the technology behind it, but it has had a massive, massive growth, exponential growth curve in recent years, and I'll explain why. Machine learning, as artificial intelligence is a subfield of computer science, machine learning is a subfield of artificial intelligence. Do you remember how I told you that an algorithm is just, that step-by-step instructions, and when it tells a computer what to do, that's a code or a program? For machine learning, part of what's happening is that the computer, the program is directing the computer to go out, to investigate certain things, to learn from that, and to update its own code as it goes. Hence the learning part of machine learning. So now instead of a human having to tell every single step in the process, this is what I want you to do, the human is programming the computer to say, notice patterns here and apply them there. Go find this information and then apply it here. It's having the computer update its own code as it goes. And this is happening on a scale where it's happening, thousands of times very quickly, so it's not like it's just a one-time thing. I'll come back to that in a minute because that can lead to problems with transparency and the ability to understand why the computer has done what the computer has done. The concept's been around for 60 years, but as I said, machine learning, it's buzzy now, and there are really two main reasons that it's had this exponential growth, okay? The first is huge advances in computer processing power. So you think of Moore's law and you think of other things where exponentially computers will get more powerful, smaller, quicker, faster. We're on the tail end of that exponential growth curve. So we've seen massive, massive advances in computer processing in the last decade or so. But we've also had huge advances in data sets. Think about the type of data that would have followed you around as a college student. For those of you in the room who were in college or who were in high school, before there was a lot of computer use, you probably had a physical student record, right? And that student record lived somewhere, and it was, for some of us, maybe longer than for others, but it wasn't that long. It certainly didn't have the time that you arrived at each class on each day. It didn't have the time you logged on to a computer. It didn't have the amount that you owed for lunch on any particular day. It didn't have the information on how to contact every single person who'd ever been listed in any file. It didn't have information about what your athletic scores may have been on any given day. We now have so much more data that each of us sheds just walking around, right? In order to get here, you may have passed by several cameras that were recording license plates on the roads that you drove on. In order to get here, the phone in your pocket may have been translocating and figuring out exactly where you were so that it could help your map system be more accurate. In order to get here, you probably did an online reservation in order to have your room reserved, and there may be all sorts of information that was being tracked from the computer that you used to do that online reservation. The point is we shed tons of data now, which has interesting implications for privacy that we can talk about another time, but we also just have so much more data available. So books that used to be only in the library, and you had to go to the library physically and read them or copy them, are now available freely online. Sometimes not so freely online, but still available. And we'll come back to that as well. So there's so much more information that we can access now. And that's really important because when we talk next about large language models, they have got to have a ton of information at this point to be very good. That opacity problem. So machine learning is mostly used for pattern recognition and for prediction. And we'll come back to that as well because prediction is just really holding up a mirror. It's saying this is what's happened before, and so we think this is what will happen next. That has some interesting implications for creativity and other things that are important to us. But machine learning is sometimes called a black box. As I said, we can know what the inputs were. We can know here's the data that this algorithm was trained on. We can know here's what the folks who developed the algorithm were optimizing it for. We can know all of that. And we can know here's the output. Here's what it predicted, or here's what it said, or here's what it did. But that part in the middle, why? What patterns was the machine recognizing? What was it zeroing in on? How many times did it update? That's really difficult to explain in a way that humans can understand. And so we sometimes call these black box algorithms. Now you can imagine that has really profound implications for my field, in the field of law. If you are a defense attorney and your client is being considered for incarceration, and one of the things that the judge has to do is decide how likely it is that your client will reoffend. And they're using a recidivism prediction tool that is based on machine learning. And that recidivism prediction tool says they are highly likely to reoffend. How are you supposed to cross-examine that? How are you supposed to ask that expert, because here it's expert testimony in some ways, how they arrived at that number? And so I've written, and a lot of people in my field have written on how these tools are already at use in the criminal justice system, and that can be pretty problematic. And it's not necessarily been reassuring how courts have approached it thus far. Okay, so now we're getting up to things that you probably have heard about a lot in the news lately, large language models. So when I was home during COVID, I wrote on GPT-3. I had read about this tool. It seemed to me really transformative, no pun intended, because of the T in GPT-3. It seemed to me that it was poised widely for adoption in the field of law, because so much of what lawyers do is they write. And I thought, this is going to be huge. This is going to change everything. And I wrote a law review article, and I published it, and I was really proud of it. And then not a whole lot happened. And people are like, what's this GPT-3 thing again, Cypher? What is this? What is it you're writing about? And then fast forward to the end of last year, and ChatGPT was released. And ChatGPT relies on the same technology that GPT-3 relied on. And suddenly, the technology was everywhere. And I thought to myself, okay, I was onto something. This is a big deal. This is going to be big for lawyers, and it certainly has been. ChatGPT came out in late 2022. GPT-4 has already been released in March of 2023. these large language models. There's a bit of an arms race, if you will. Now every company wants to release their large language model. There's a lot of internal research and debate in the field over whether large language models were really ready for prime time, whether they should have been released when they were released, whether or not there's pressure to release them too early, and what the problems with that may be. What are these tools? Let's break down each word of GPT. The G in GPT stands for generative. It just means it creates. Well, I'll use that word with air quotes around it, because whether or not it truly creates, right? That's a question for philosophers and others that I think is an interesting question to explore. But it generates, it produces something. There's some kind of output that you can see at the end of it. Pre-trained, I want to stop for a minute and really dig down on this, okay? So in order to have a large language model that is as impressive as you know, ChatGPT and GPT-4 are in so many ways, and don't get me wrong, these are impressive tools, and they could be used in impressive ways. But in order to have something that is that impressive, you really needed massive data training sets. At the point at which these tools were being released, the conventional thinking for large language models was the larger the better for a data set. There's actually been some really interesting research coming out now where people are trying to see, can we have large language models that are equally good that are trained on smaller data training sets? That's really intriguing for a reason you're about to see. In order to get a big enough data training set that we can train these models to have them really sound like humans when they produce things, we had to train them on a ton of human writing. And if you need a ton of human writing, you can't really be that picky. And so these tools were trained on scrapes of the internet that included things like books and newspaper articles, but also included things like Reddit and other parts of the internet where maybe we don't always, you know, it's certainly human speaking, but it may not be something that any of us would necessarily think of as the best example of human speaking. And so we can't really be surprised when these tools reflect back to us our own biases, when they reflect back the biases that are part of our larger society, because they've been trained on us. All they are doing is holding up a mirror. And the type of writing that is popular sometimes on the internet, I'm sure each of you can imagine that if you had a tool that was trained on your articles alone, it would look very different than a tool that was trained on your articles plus everything in your comment sections, right? Those two tools are going to be really different tools. Okay, and then finally, transformer. I'm not going to try to attempt to explain the mathematics behind transformer architecture because I don't fully understand it, and I think it's very, very complicated. Suffice it to say, relatively new technology, first sort of released in a research paper from Google back in 2017, and it really allowed for there to be a way to recognize context in language and patterns in language that was really, really important and was a breakthrough. So this is why these LLMs, even though they're using technology, some of which has been around for a while, this is why they're so popular now and why you're hearing so much about them. So as I said, in layman's terms, you know, the way that it was explained in the New York Times back in 2020, GPT-3 can read and write, and not badly either. And one thing that's really impressive about tools like ChatGPT is there's something we call a few-shot learner. So your input doesn't have to be very large. You can input in roses are red, violets are, right? And we all know that the next part of that, because we recognize the pattern, is blue. But instead of just stopping at blue, it can keep going. It can keep saying, if blue is the next word in the pattern, what's the most likely next word after that? And what's the most likely next word after that? And remember, it's been trained on massive, massive portions of the internet, massive portions of books, massive portions of articles. So it's got an awful lot of information it can use to continue following that pattern. These technologies are impressive, and they have massive potential and wonderful things, really, that they can be doing. They also, however, have a lot of problems that are well documented, and that anyone who's considering using them or anyone who's interested in having them needs to be aware of. I tell my law students all the time, I don't think that generative AI replaces lawyers. at least anytime soon. I really don't. I do think that these tools can help make us better, more efficient, faster for our clients, other things like that, but only if we understand them, and only if we understand their limitations, and only if we're not using them, without any reference to all of the various problems. So one of the first issues that has been pretty well documented with large language models, including in research papers from the companies themselves that released them, right? OpenAI, which released GPT-3, they had a great research paper when they released that. They were very transparent at the time. They included a lot of information about known issues with bias and other things. And again, it's just holding up a mirror to our society. We can't be surprised when something that is trained on, internet chat boards is reflecting back language that at times is going to be misogynistic or toxic or homophobic or something like that. And so we know that there are problems with bias with these tools, and that's certainly something that anyone who's using them needs to be aware of and needs to think about. AI hallucinations are a big deal. That's kind of a fancy way for talking about the fact that these machines, these technologies, these tools, they make things up. And they make them up in a really convincing way. And a couple of lawyers around the country recently have made headlines and have found this out the hard way, because they've used ChatGPT to draft legal briefs that they've turned into a judge and that they've served on opposing counsel. And ChatGPT, which is, to be clear, not a research tool, made up fake cases and had the lawyers include them in the briefs. And then the opposing counsel said, Your Honor, we've checked all the legal databases and we can't find these cases. Can you please have opposing counsel give us a copy? And by the way, that's extraordinarily unusual. There are a lot of really, really impressive legal research databases. If you can't find a case, something is going on, right? And lo and behold, it turns out that the lawyers had used ChatGPT. They thought ChatGPT was perhaps a super research tool, that maybe it had access to cases no one else had access to. And it was like, no, it was making it up. And apparently there was even a dialogue between one of the lawyers and ChatGPT in the log that said, these are real cases, right? And ChatGPT responded, yes. So these tools, again, I hate to use the term lie, because that implies some human element to these tools, and I want to be careful we don't anthropomorphize them. But these tools will report as accurate, totally made up material. So there have been examples, including fake newspaper articles. So a law professor prompted ChatGPT, said, write me an article about sexual harassment claims at law schools and provide examples. And as part of the article that ChatGPT produced, it said that a law professor at a school here on the East Coast had been accused of, in some way, some type of misconduct involving students on a trip to Alaska. And this law professor wrote an op-ed where he said, not only have I not been accused of misconduct on a student trip to Alaska, I've never taken students on a trip, and I've never been to Alaska. But what did ChatGPT cite as proof for this allegation? A Washington Post article that the Washington Post says was never written. So AI hallucinations are a big problem, and they are something that everyone needs to be aware of. These tools are not, fact-checking tools. They're certainly not research tools. Again, they're predicting a pattern. If you wanted to write an article about this, then this is probably what would come next, and this is probably what would come next. But they're not actually linked to databases necessarily where these articles exist. It's not like the Washington Post used this and got it wrong. It's a made-up article that never existed. And we've seen that it made up legal cases, it's made up newspaper articles, it's made up fake citations to scientific journals. It's accused people, the New York Times had a great article this week, what's your recourse when this tool defames you? Right? When there was a politician who the tool said is a terrorist. What's your recourse there? Right? These are really interesting legal questions that are unsolved right now. Really interesting copyright issues. come back to that in a minute too, because some of this should concern those of you who have paywalls and click-throughs and all sorts of other things. So AI hallucinations, massive problem, and you need to be aware of it. I tell my students, treat this like a semi-talented paralegal. If you wouldn't sign that paralegal's brief and put it in front of the judge, and you shouldn't, because you have a duty to supervise as a lawyer, then don't trust this. Look at it maybe as an interesting way of writing, tweaking your own writing, or at the very least, an interesting first draft that you can then follow through, verify. And by the way, judges are catching on. There are several federal judges right now who require attorneys who use these tools to sign as part of their pleadings, essentially an affidavit saying, I used this, but I checked every word of it and I checked every citation. These aren't fake cases. So judges are catching on. Misinformation. So again, these tools can make things up because all they're doing is trying to predict what would come next. They have no sense of being able to tell what is true and what is not. But this is especially troubling because of research that was reported on in the MIT Technology Review this summer that suggests that humans are more likely to believe misinformation created by AI than misinformation created by other humans. So the way that the researchers did this is they had some tweets. The tweets had misinformation. Some were generated by AI, some were generated by humans. And the test subjects were more likely to rate as believable or credible the misinformation that had been created by AI than the misinformation that had been created by humans. We don't really know why yet. We're not sure. It was a small difference. I think it was something like 3% more likely. But at scale, when you think about how much these tools can write and how quickly they can kind of pollute the internet with all sorts of information, that should give us pause as well. More likely to believe misinformation. Potential copyright intellectual property claims. As you can imagine, some of the folks whose writing was used to train these tools are pretty interested in knowing what their cut of the profits is going to be, since their intellectual property, their writing, was used. Same with generative AI, although I'm not talking about it today. Generative AI can also be used to create images or to create music. And it's the same thing. The artists whose work was trained, the tool was trained on, would like to know where their cut is, whether they're musicians or visual artists. We don't know. There have been copyright lawsuits brought. We don't know. We don't have answers yet. That's going to work their way through the court system. It's going to take some time. But that's a really interesting issue. I did see that recently some of these companies have started allowing, they've put out like 2 lines of code that a website master or webmaster can use in their code that essentially will say, don't scrape my information. You can't use my website to train your tool. Now, they've already scraped the whole internet, so that may be that the proverbial horse is out of the barn, but at least anything going forward, you may have the ability to say, don't scrape my information, at least for some companies and the web crawlers they're using. Because again, in order to keep making these better, each generation has a larger data training set. You need more and more and more information. I'm working on a law review article right now on something called AI cannibalism. Listen to this. Think about it like this. In 2020, when some of these tools were scraping the internet, how much of the internet was AI-generated content? Pretty low percentage, right? Because things like ChatGPT weren't widely available, and so there just wasn't as much. How much of the internet now, and how much of the internet in 3 years, might include AI-generated content? And researchers they're ringing the warning bell here. They're saying, hey, these tools, when the data training set includes too much AI-generated content, when the AI is essentially cannibalizing itself, they break down. There's model breakdown. So there's a lot that's happening, and there's a lot that people need to be aware of. The intellectual property claims, I think, is especially interesting for online news sites. There was an article from March of 2023 in the New York Times, publishers worry AI chatbots will cut readership. And the idea was that for companies that get a lot of their traffic, especially their sort of click here advertising or click here even paywall, sign up for a thing from search engines, there's a fear that now that search engines may have more generative AI embedded in them, that people actually won't need to click through to your website, because the search engine will pull up what they think is a relevant paragraph that they've sort of digested from your article, and people will stop there. So there's a lot of interesting things at play, sort of on the business side for all of these tools as well. The reporter in this case used ChatGPT to write an article about a tool or a topic that the reporter had been writing on, tax loss harvesting. I'm not a tax attorney, but I can tell you that sounds very complicated to me. It sounds like a complicated thing, and it also sounds, given the criminal penalties for tax problems, like something you would want to get right. And so the reporter had ChatGPT write an article about this topic. And then the reporter included that information, said, here's what they've had in it. And what I think was really interesting is the reporter said it was kind of uncanny, kind of amazing. It wasn't terrible. It wasn't total gibberish. But there was a lot of really important nuance and context that was missing. It says, well, I wouldn't call any of the bot's analysis incorrect per se. You'd need lots of additional context to act on it. And the reporter went on to say, here are things that a reporter would know to include in the story that would be valuable context, or things that would be important for someone who is really interested in this tax loss question to be able to have and to be able to do. So I thought that was really an interesting use of folks sort of testing it. I've done it myself. I've asked ChatGPT to generate 500 words on a topic that I've written on. I think I asked ChatGPT for 500 words on how we should learn lessons from early internet regulation and apply it to blockchain regulation, which is something I have a forthcoming law review article on. Now, the fact that it did anything is pretty impressive there. There's not a ton of people necessarily yet talking about how early internet regulation should apply to blockchain regulation. And so what it produced was, in some ways, certainly impressive. Now, with, humbly, and this won't sound very humble, but humbly, I didn't think it was anywhere near as good as what my co-author and I had put out. I thought that it was, again, it was circular, it was lacking nuance, it was lacking really interesting insights and ideas that we had come up with, but it wasn't terrible. So if you haven't tried it yet, and be careful, remember that these tools, these massive databases, anything you're putting into them may or may not be contributing to their training data. So my law students cannot put any client data that is confidential or sensitive into these tools, because they may have just broken their obligation to keep confidentiality. So all of you should know the privacy concerns are worth thinking through before you play around with the tool. But if you have something that you don't consider especially private, and you'd like to see how ChatGPT would fare against you, you could do that. Another thing you can do, and I think an interesting use of the tool, and one that I'm going to be trying with my law students in our writing class this semester, is here's some of my own writing. How would you recommend I make it better? That's actually a pretty fun way to play around with the tool, and one that can be interesting. ChatGPT told me that I have sometimes run-on sentences, and that there are times I could move topics up front. And I thought, yeah, I mean, some of that's okay. I suppose that's true. So in some ways, you could use it as an interesting editor. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about striking the right balance, about ethical and professional use. Because again, I think these tools are incredible. To the extent we can save clients money in the field of law by using these, we should, but not by breaching our own professional obligations, not by doing something that takes humans out of the loop. That would be catastrophic. And I think it's similar in your field. I think that to the extent these can be tools that help humans, that's a great thing. But I think it would be catastrophic to imagine that these tools in some way replace humans, that they replace journalists. ChatGPT can't have local relationships. ChatGPT can't interview sources. ChatGPT can't sort of know the right person to call when you need a quote. It'll just make all that stuff up, right? That's bad. We don't want that. So certainly your professional organizations are already all over this, as they should be. And to the extent you haven't had conversations in your own sort of companies or newsrooms about how and if and when we want to use these. I would encourage everyone to be having those conversations because they're important. I think education is so key. I tell lawyers and judges that I think if you want to use these tools, you really have to understand them well enough to know both the pros and the cons, because you can't make an informed decision if you don't understand the pros and the cons. Certainly in the field of law, we have a continuing legal obligation to educate ourselves on ongoing technologies. Every lawyer has that obligation, and so we need to do it, and some states make it really explicit and actually require that lawyers stay abreast of ongoing technologies and things like that. I also think it's really important to always consider having a human in the loop. So human in the loop is a sort of AI term that has a lot of different meanings. As I use it here today, what I mean to be saying is nothing should ever go from a large language model to your readers without a human being part of that, without a human checking things, without a human reading things, without a human feeling pretty confident that this is something that you could stand behind. For my law students, you know, if you file something that ChatGPT wrote and there's a problem, ChatGPT doesn't get sanctioned. ChatGPT doesn't face suspension. You do. So I think the idea of a human in the loop is really important and is something that everyone should kind of keep in mind. I also just want to make the larger philosophical argument that artificial intelligence needs all of us. So when I start my AI in the law class, one of the first things I do is have my students watch a TED Talk from a researcher who says AI needs every single one of us. It needs philosophers, and it needs ethicists, and it needs journalists, and it needs lawyers. It needs everybody to pull up a seat to the table and start thinking about how we want these tools to be at use in our society. We're going to probably see increasing regulation of these tools. What do we want that to look like? How do we want it at use in our schools? How do we want it at use in our communities? How do we want it at use in our newsrooms? None of us can afford to sort of sit this one out and say, I just don't get that tech stuff, right? We all need to be a part of it because it's not going anywhere. It's not going anywhere, right? This isn't one you can kind of wait out. So instead, we all need to be active participants. We all need to shape what it is that it's going to look like for our future. Stephen Adams said, this kind of reminds me of Wikipedia, right? When Wikipedia came out, and the idea is Wikipedia isn't a source, Wikipedia is collecting sources, and you need to drop below Wikipedia and check the math. Yes, let me tell you of the ways it does remind me of Wikipedia, and let me tell you why I think it's more fraught than the issues were with Wikipedia. So I will say I was on a provost's task force earlier this year at WVU where we were attempting to kind of guide some syllabus statements for faculty to include on the use of generative AI. Because as you can imagine, we're dealing with an issue, as all schools, colleges are, of students wanting to use this tool to sometimes do the work for them. And we have to figure out how we're going to handle that, because as I stand here today, I'm not aware of any fully reliable detection tools. People will try to tell you there are some. As I stand here today, I haven't been convinced by anything I saw, and I think most tech experts will tell you it's a bit of a game of whack-a-mole. You know, we figure out a detection method and they work around it. So as I stand here today, I'm not aware of any super reliable detection tools. So someone on that task force committee said, isn't this just like Wikipedia? Remember when we had to deal with that? And in some ways, yes, it is exactly like that. But in other ways, Wikipedia works because a whole global network of people who are committed to keeping it updated and fact-checking it and trying to remove. Is it perfect? No. No. Would I want to stand up in court and argue something citing Wikipedia? At the same time, there are humans in the loop. There are opportunities to correct things. There are opportunities to change things. So in sense, the principle is the same. You have to check the math. But I think here, the fact of AI hallucinations, I mean, on Wikipedia, if you tried to link to a fake Washington Post article, that hyperlink isn't going to work. Someone's going to figure out pretty quickly that article doesn't exist. With this, I think the issues in that sense are more fraught. So I think it's a perfect analogy, but it's a bit more fraught. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Let's address that.
So Steve, if you were to put the same prompt into ChatGPT on 2 different days, you would get 2 different outputs. It's not like there's like the ChatGPT page for this prompt, like there is the Wikipedia page for this thing. It's constantly changing, in part because that's what machine learning does. It makes a bunch of changes. I want to be careful how I say this, because I know that these companies are trying to address some of the privacy concerns and other things. But at least at some point, your prompts were part of their data training. So they were training the model based on what you were inputting into it. So things were changing, and you wouldn't get, I mean, who is it? You can't step in the river ever the same twice. Sort of the same thing. You can't get the same thing twice because the tools are always updating and changing. By the way, it seems to me these companies have started getting a lot less transparent as this arms race has happened and this stuff has become massively lucrative about how they're doing this stuff. The research papers, some of them are starting to dry up, and we're getting less information than we used to. So it's even hard to know how to do that. But it's really, I suppose you would have to almost try to, have some student be like, show me your ChatGPT log. I mean, I don't want to be the academic disciplinary officer trying to deal with that mess. So at this point, it's really, there are a couple of things we can do, right? So we can offer only closed book exams in class, where for law students, we make you write and we shut down your access to ChatGPT and you do it in class. I mean, that's how they do the bar, so that's one option. For my class, I'm really trying to educate my students. I'm trying to say, all the stuff I just said to you, I say a lot of that to my students, and I add on a lot extra specific to law. And then I say, and I also want you to think about human creativity. Think about this. If a tool has only been trained on every legal opinion that has ever existed, that's an incredible database, and that might help you make arguments that are compelling to a judge because it's based on every legal opinion ever existed. But how's that going to help you change the law? How's that going to help you have the next massive case that radically transforms the way we think about things and advances the development of law? It's not, because it can only give you what's already come, repackaged. I don't want to lose that. I need my students to keep writing. I need them to realize that the iterative process of writing allows us to see holes in our logic, allows us to become better. I don't know about you, but the process of writing a first draft often helps me realize, this is not ready for prime time. I've got to track down these 2 or 3 things. And if I just ask ChatGPT to do that for me, I miss that. So I convince them all first of why they should use it the way I want them to use it, and then I let them play with it on their own writing. How do you make your writing better, not how do you replace yourself with this tool? So thanks for that question, Steve. Don, you talked about the black box problem. Are you aware of any efforts to make that less of a problem? And the answer is yes, though the results have been, I think, less promising thus far than I would have hoped. So there's a whole field called explainable AI. And this whole field recognizes if lawyers are going to use this stuff, if the National Security Agency, if folks who do security are going to use this, they've got to know why it's saying what it's saying. You can't just trust this output. You've got to be able to look under the hood and figure it out. And so I have my AI and law students do a whole segment on explainable AI and on the advances in explainable AI. It hasn't been quite, Christina, what I would hope for yet. Maybe we'll get there. As I said, there's actually some really new research that maybe we can do large language models with smaller data sets, that maybe we can have AI that's more explainable. One of the exercises I have my students do in AI and law is I ask them to write a memo to, they're interning at a mayor's office, and this company is asking them, is coming to them and saying, hey, we're going to help you detect food stamp fraud. You can use algorithm A, and it's kind of standard regression analysis, and it catches it about 75% of the time. Or you can use algorithm B, it's machine learning, and it catches it maybe 80% of the time. Which one do you want to use and why? And we talk through all the pros and cons of standard regression analysis. For those of you who stats has been a long time ago, is just mathematical tools for forecasting, but you can understand why the answer is what it is. It's mathematically complicated, but a human can do it. Whereas machine learning, we aren't necessarily sure why the algorithm says these 80% is food stamp fraud, but these 20% are not. We don't know. And what I ask my students to think through are, what's the cost? What is the the decision to use a less transparent tool is a policy decision, and a mayor's office should own that. And a mayor's office should say, we think that the savings are going to be great enough that we recognize it's less transparent, but we stand behind it because. I'm actually more okay with people who own up to the costs and say, yes, I recognize there are all these problems, and I am putting in place these safeguards against them. We still think it's worth using because. I'm more okay with that than I am with folks just being like, oh, well, it's a machine, it must be right. We put an undeserved veneer of objectivity and neutrality on AI that it doesn't deserve. We as humans tend to think that if a machine says it, it must be objective and neutral and accurate. That's just not true, right? They are our creations, they reflect our biases, they reflect our limitations and other things. So they're amazing, but they're neither objective nor neutral. So thanks for that question. Okay, Linda, and I can see your name tag, has a great question that I'll repeat. She's really intrigued by the idea of the fake newspaper articles. And she says, I know a lot goes into sort of crafting the question, and is there a way to craft the right question? So Linda, part of what you're talking about is a brand new field that is huge called prompt engineering. So a lot of you probably know about search engine optimization. If you work with your websites, you know a lot about search engine optimization. Prompt engineering is kind of the new field that is going to be big. That is, what's the right way to ask the questions to get what we want from these tools, right? So I've seen really interesting examples of people prompting the tool, be like, explain it to me like I'm 11, right? Or something like that. Right, or like when I put in my own writing, I said, make suggested edits and explain why for each, right? Or something like that. So prompt engineering, Linda, absolutely important, absolutely something we should be considering. As I said, the lawyers at the case who got sanctioned in New York purportedly did say, these are real cases, right? And the tool said, sure are. And the law professor who prompted the tool that it made the fake cases, I think he had also said, provide evidence or provide something, and that evidence was a fake article. So, you know, again, right, but I mean, just that's what they are doing. They're not search tools. They are not research tools, okay? They do not supplant research. They are generative writing tools that people are using as research tools. And I think that it's because they're sometimes decent at research, they can sometimes compile stuff that's right, that people are more likely to believe them. And again, it's, you know, the kind of famous test in AI for many years was something we called the Turing test, the imitation game, right? The idea that we would know AI had really arrived when, and this is something that Alan Turing articulated, I think back in the 1950s, right? When you could have one human, and then you could have a machine, and then you could have another human who was kind of the judge, and through a computer terminal, the human and the machine would talk to each other, and the human who was the judge would know one of them was a machine and one of them was a human. And the Turing test would be passed when we humans were unable to distinguish who is the machine and who is the human. I mean, I think, you know, you can Google ChatGPT breaks the Turing test. I mean, you know, I think we're there, right? Like, not only are we unable to distinguish, we find them more, you know, believable when they're lying to us. So that's just something to be aware of. And I also think there's a whole field of human-computer interaction and a whole field that looks at the sort of philosophy of why we want to think these tools are truthful. People are now, you know, releasing software that allows you to give your LLM a personality, right? I mean, this stuff starts to creep me out a lot. I'll be really candid with you. I get really worried about, gosh, you know, I have 3 small kids, and I'm really careful about sort of what they're doing with technology and where they are with things, because I'm always reminding them it's not a human, right? I want you to know that, because I don't want you to form this attachment to this thing that is definitely not a human. Don?
Not to change.
That's right. That's right, Don. And I will say, the terms of service for these tools, because I know we all carefully read our terms of service before we hit accept, the terms of service warn you. They warn you about all of this, right? These companies are protecting themselves. The terms of service are like, we might lie to you, we may make stuff up, this is what might happen. You shouldn't trust this. If you try to make some of these tools give you too much legal advice, they will be like, I am not a lawyer. I am a chatbot. You should call a lawyer, right? Like they will actually kind of break down to that. But there are every time these companies put up a guardrail, someone figures out a way around the guardrail. Prompt engineer it to get past its own guardrail. There's been some really interesting reporting about that too. I think that's right, Don. They aren't failing. They're not designed to be research tools. They are designed to write, and to write in a way that predicts how we would write about something. And they have no basis for knowing what is true and what is not. April?
Importantly, time.
April, I couldn't have said it better myself. April said, more importantly, they are trained to write how we would write based on the data training that they've already had, which by necessity only is what's presently existing. They aren't predicting the future, and might be flawed based on us. So when I talk about recidivism prediction tools are trained often on existing criminal history data. Well, we know we've had massive issues with bias in the criminal history, in the criminal system for decades. So we really can't be surprised when a recidivism prediction tool trained on historical criminal data reflects back the bias of that historical criminal data. And again, we can't rely on these tools to create, because that's not what they're doing. They're just chopping up what we've said and putting it back together and giving it back to us, right? We're the creators. We're the ones who have to do that. Further, a lot of these tools will note things like, this data training has not been updated since 2022. It will have nothing in it past that, right? You can't ask this tool about the, U.S. Women's World Cup soccer loss. It's not going to be able to talk to you about that, right? Because it's not going to be in its training data because it's just too recent. And although they may try to keep updating by continually scraping, remember that AI cannibalism issue I warned you about. There are some people who speculate that some of these LLMs may actually go back to like a 2020 data set that may end up being the most pristine and cleanest one because it'll have the least AI in it, and so it'll be the best to use, but it will never be updated. So lots of interesting, and I should also note, to be fair, curation of the data sets is possible, and there are companies who are attempting to curate the data sets to look more at what they're putting in. Again, that's much more possible if we're able to get to a place where LLMs can be trained on smaller data sets. Till now, it's been bigger is better, but it's awfully hard to curate the internet. So they've got a Sisyphean task ahead of them. Yes, Pam. Yes, so I think it's at use a lot. Sometimes people are saying we're using, so some newspapers, some newsrooms have already developed policies where they're saying things like, anytime we're using something generated, we will note that. We will just say, this article was generated in part or in whole by AI, okay? So some of them are saying that. I also think that there are a lot of people who might be using them, and I've seen some, and I was discussing with folks beforehand, some recent stories that there may be newsrooms that are using it and not even noting that, and just kind of putting it out there, and that they may be doing it a lot. I'm not super familiar yet with exactly kind of the scale of that, but in much the same way that somebody says, are you aware of lawyers using this? It's like, oh yeah. Like if for no other reason than somebody's working on something and they plug it into ChatGPT and it helps them edit it and they push it back out or something like that. But yes, newsrooms are absolutely using this. I think, does anybody want to share a way that they've heard about it being used or misused or anything? Yeah, go ahead. Got it. So someone was sharing that in their newsroom, they've used it to test it, and it hasn't been especially impressive. It hasn't been something that they would put out and feel comfortable sharing with their readers. Again, I think using it as a tool to edit your own writing, I find that a really interesting application of it, and one that gives me a lot less concern than other ways of using it. And I also, I think that there is technology, there's research happening right now where there's like this idea that maybe we could get some type of watermark of sorts, that anything that's generated with AI will have to bear a watermark, and so we'll be able to tell. There's talk that maybe there'll be some regulation where if you're using AI, you have to disclose that. I don't know that this is gonna work, but that's interesting. When I wrote my article, I entitled it, "A Human Being Wrote This Law Review Article." And it was kind of a funny tongue-in-cheek thing, But I didn't use ChatGPT for any portion of that. At the time, ChatGPT wasn't available, it was GPT-3. But it was really important for me to sort of stake out, this is human-generated content about AI content. Yes? That's a really interesting question. So April's question is, can you imagine a situation where there's kind of two tiers? I'm a company, and you can have, at one tier you have human-generated content, and at one tier you have, and I like how you used AI-influenced, because I don't think anybody's going to put out fully AI-generated stuff unless they won a whole lot of lawsuits. AI-influenced content. I think that still gives me a lot of pause, and let me tell you why. Sometimes people get really excited about how AI can solve what we in the legal field call the access to justice gap. And that is the idea that there are people around the country who need lawyers and can't afford them. There's an access to justice gap. And people are like, AI can help solve the access to justice gap. And I'm like, I mean, maybe I want legal aid to have the same tools that the major law firms have, but I certainly don't want it to be you're poor so you get the robot lawyer, right? Like that makes me nervous, given how important legal representation is to people's health, livelihoods, rights, freedom, all of that. So I hear what you're saying, April, and maybe I'll eventually get to a place where I can sort of see that and be comfortable with it. I think I would rather people still commit to the same level of quality and to sort of have a newsroom policy that says we do sometimes use AI to help us produce the content we are selling to you, but we have committed to you that it is still meeting our journalistic standards of integrity, excellence, accuracy. We're just doing it because it helps us do it a little more efficiently. That's what I would like to see. Okay, Monty has a great philosophical question. This reflects back us. What does that mean in a society where we seem less concerned about truth, more concerned about winning? I love philosophical questions. I've also taught philosophy of law classes, and I think I talk all the time, the concept of truth is an important one in law. It's often the portion of the point of a trial. What is the sort of arrived at truth that we are all willing to move forward with, or something like that. And I read sometimes that we're in a post-truth society, and that terrifies me. I think we can't be in a society where there is no more objective truth. It's an interesting question, Monty, that I'm sure there are a lot of AI philosophers that I'm sure people are looking at. I think our idea of truth changed with the internet anyway, because there was we're conditioned, especially those of us who are of a certain age, we're conditioned if it's in writing, it's true. It means someone verified it. It means there was an editor. It means there was a publisher who was willing to put it out there. That's how it used to be to get something into a book. And now anyone who wants can put anything they want on the internet, but our brains are still conditioned to be like, oh, well, if it's on there, it must be true or something. I think young people are savvy consumers of information. I think some of the problems, I've not seen research to this point, but I would love to see research to this point, are misinformation and disinformation bigger problems for older people than younger people? I think that some of what we do at WVU is try to help students be critical thinkers and critically approach information and figure out when is this trustworthy and when is it not, and when is this evidence-based and when is it not. But I agree with you, Monty, that there does seem to be a general erosion of expertise, respect, and belief in truth. So I don't know where that puts us. Thank you. Thanks.